Surprise! The Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, is at the war. And it's always a surprise whenever a high-profile American official goes to the war. They never say they are on their way ahead of time. They never tell you until they're there, sometimes until after they've already been there and left, because they say it would not be safe otherwise. So it was supposed to be a surprise when we were told today that the Defense Secretary was in Afghanistan. Now, even though they said it is a surprise, it is not that much of a surprise in the larger sense, because it's December and defense secretaries and even sometimes presidents tend to make their way to visit the troops in harm's way around Christmas time, just about every year. We can see the pattern because it's been 11 years in a row now that we have had troops in harm's way during the holidays, as Americans have been fighting wars abroad for more than a decade now. Given that, it is a nice tradition, I think, that we send over some top-level civilians in December or any time, both to visit the troops, but also, importantly, to bring the national media with them, to bring national media attention to where they are going. It's a rather good use of a photo op and a publicity stunt to drag the press corps that typically only follows very high-level politicians, to drag the press corps into a war that they might otherwise not be talking about. And so we see this happen every holiday season, and we get these images of the defense secretary today talking to the troops, and we get the national reporters there to cover this bigwig on his big trip, and we get those reporters exposed to the top U.S. military commanders in the war. So we get those top flight reporters explained, how they get to have the war explained to them by the top tier commanders, explaining what's going on in the progress of the fight. That's how it goes roughly every December. This year, though, there was a slight change. This year, the top U.S. military commander in the war did brief Secretary Panetta on the war, and he was seen. You can see him on the video here. The press is shooting while visiting the war, but that top military commander is not himself speaking to the reporters this year, because this top military commander is not in a position to be answering any unscripted questions from the press corps right about now. Not when his emails to a Tampa socialite are being scoured by a review board at home. And his next job at NATO is on hold during the investigation. General John Allen is still running the war in Afghanistan, but that's happening while he is still under investigation at home for those emails, after his name and his behavior came up during the previous commander of the war in Afghanistan's sex scandal, when he was forced to resign from his job heading up the CIA. And that has now squirreled its way into a maybe unrelated but concurrent scandal about why General Petraeus seems to have been secretly taping a conversation he held with a Fox News reporter last year. The reporter says she is not the one who taped it. It was not her tape. And so when that tape was leaked to the Washington Post, if it didn't come from the reporter, does that mean it came from General Petraeus? If so, why was he taping his conversations with reporters without them knowing it? And who leaked it and why? So that's still unresolved. And General Petraeus, of course, was the commander before General Allen. And, of course, the commander before General Petraeus, who had to resign in his own political scandal, he's now poised to release a new tell-all blockbuster book, which will, of course, open that whole scandal up again. So those are the last three top guys. In terms of the top-level leadership in the war in Afghanistan, it's kind of a freaking mess, right? And it has been a mess for a long time. The Pentagon just released its report that shows the results of President Obama's big surge of troops into Afghanistan after he took office. The report found that violence in Afghanistan after the surge is higher than it was before the surge. Enemy-initiated attacks are higher now than they were before the surge started, the surge that was supposed to decimate the enemy. One of the other main goals of the surge, which was to train up Afghan forces, that goal has been roughly 1/23 successful. I mean that in the sense of a fraction. There are 23 Afghan army brigades, and of those 23, one can operate independently without support of American or NATO forces. One of 23. And remember, the surge is done, and that's the result. More violence and 1 out of 23 brigades. And there are 66,000 Americans in Afghanistan right now. And American combat operations in Afghanistan are slated to continue there for another 2 years. But the whole basis of the plan to keep Americans in combat operations there for another 2 years was this idea that the surge was going to reduce violence and make it so the Afghan army could fight on its own. Well, guess what didn't happen? Either of those things. I don't mean to be a bummer, but it's true. At least the Pentagon says it's true. And it seems important. Not just for the military, not just for politics, but for us as a country. It's our war, right? Even the traveling press corps with Secretary Panetta, and even the people who can get stories into their papers and onto the wire services about what's going on in Afghanistan, even when we are talking about the war, which is rarely, what the press and the politicians who are talking about it seem mostly to be focused on is what happens after 2 years from now. What happens after the end of 2014? Are there going to be 1,000 Americans who stay around in country after combat operations are over? Is it 1,000 or 6,000 or 10,000? We're told that the president will make a decision soon, that he's reviewing options about the U.S. mission after 2014, about how many residual troops will stay after combat operations are over. But combat operations do not end for another 2 years. And here's one other thing to consider about this. Here are the troop levels, the number of American soldiers deployed in Afghanistan over the years. The big hump there, you can see the Obama surge starting late in 2009 and ending just a few months ago. Now, side by side, next to it, over the same time period, these are the number of U.S. troops killed in Afghanistan in each of those years. See the pattern? I mean, look at those numbers on the same chart. The more troops you send to the war in Afghanistan, the more American troops die in the war in Afghanistan. Of the more than 2,000 American troops who have died in the war in Afghanistan, of the more than 2,000, more than 1,200 of those, more than half, have died since the start of the surge in 2010, in just the last few years of an 11-year-long war. And so as the White House decides what happens in these last 2 years that they have slated for continued combat operations in Afghanistan, there is this very pressing question. Not for what happens after 2014, but for what happens now. I mean, how big are you going to let that number get? Yes, we need to talk about what's going to happen after combat is over in 2014, but it's 2012. There's 2 years between now and then. What happens right now? What happens at the end of 2012? What happens in 2013? 2013 starts in 2 weeks.